Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Boone, and I am the Marketing Manager for the NSF-ISR Division here at NSF International. I want to thank you for joining us today's webinar where our speakers are going to discuss some lessons learned during the transition audits. Just wanted to give a few details about the webinar today. We're going to be recording the webinar, so all the attendees will be muted. You can use the chat function for any questions that you have during the webinar. We will do our Q&A session at the end of the webinar from these questions, so please use that area. As a follow-up, you guys will receive a recording of the webinar as well as a full PDF of the slides. I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers today. First, we have Martin Willem. He is a Quality Management Business Unit Manager. Martin has 18 years in the third-party certification business, covering a wide variety of functions including auditing, training, public speaking, mentoring, and operational management, both domestic and international. Prior to that, Mr. Willem had 8 years of industrial engineering and quality management experience at organizations serving the aerospace, automotive, and metal fabrication industries. Our second speaker today is Joy Kennison-Longery. She's our Environmental Health and Safety Business Unit Manager. Joy is a graduate of the University of Washington, Seattle, where she graduated from the School of Public Health and Safety with a Master's in Public Health, a BS in Environmental Health and Safety, and a BA in Spanish. She is a licensed professional environmental engineer, registered sanitarian, and certified in Arctic cold regions as a bilingual in English. Specialized expertise in the areas of environmental health and safety, including utilities, transportation, air quality, asset management, greenhouse gas, carbon footprints, and environmental program policies, protection, and compliance. I want to thank you again for joining us in this webinar, and it's really greatly appreciated. Go ahead and take it away, Marty.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining. Just a basic overview of what we're going to be covering today. We'll look at the introduction of NSF International, our transition process for 9001, 14001, and RC 14001. We'll look at what's new with the 2015 version of the standard. We'll also look at what's the same. We'll explore how to have an effective transition to the new version of the standard, as well as talking about some tools that we have available, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers at the end of it. NSF International is a global independent public health and safety organization, and our mission and focus have always been protecting and improving human health. And that extends to the different areas that you can see here on the slide, including food safety, sustainability, water quality, health sciences, consumer products, and the ISR international standard strategic registrations, that cover aerospace, automotive, information security, and environmental occupational health and safety as well. So we do have a full suite of services within ISR, but also globally through NSF International. As I mentioned, our third-party registration, this is all housed under NSF-ISR for automotive, aerospace, business quality management. The 9001 is sort of a catch-all because it can be adapted and used in pretty much any industry. Joy's standards, the 14001, the OHSAS 18001, which will be changing shortly to the ISO 45001 for occupational health and safety, and also covering responsible care for responsible care management systems and RC 14001. My business unit also covers medical devices, the 13485, and the information security, whether it be information technology or information security, being ITMS or IFMS. So we'd like to start off with a polling question, if we could. If you could please let us know just by clicking on the different boxes if you're certified to either these standards or other standards with NSF-ISR or another certification body, or if you're not currently certified. And Katie, I will throw it to you to let me know when it's safe to go ahead.
Go ahead, Marty.
So it looks like 90% of our audience is the 9001 quality management system, and we have one participant today who isn't currently certified. I'd like to welcome you to this, maybe some insight to the 9001, 2015, 14001, and RC 14000. The transition process. We've been at this for a little while. The standard was introduced September 15th, 2015, and since then the certification bodies did their due diligence in putting together their programs for transition and getting them approved by their accreditation body, which we did in late 2015, and the process started. We now are in a situation where we have approximately 6.5 months before the three standards, the 9001 2008, the 14001 2014, and the RC 14001 2013 will become obsolete. According to the data that we've got through our accreditation body and the International Association of Accredited Registrars, less than half of organizations registered globally have completed the transition. So many organizations have waited until this year to get moving with it or to get serious about it and get their certification transition process, but that's okay. It's going to be a very busy time for the first 3 quarters of this year while we try to get everyone taken care of. And I think a big part of the problem so far is maybe organizations have thought that it was going to be very difficult based on some of the changes to the standards and the way they need to think or articulate the way their system works. But it may not be as hard as you think, because even though there are some changes to the way the standard is written, certainly the format is different, but a lot of the key concepts are the same. Happily, in looking at our transition certification decisions, our records, and we'll give you some data later on, show that many clients have transitioned with few or zero CARs, be they minor or major, being issued. Obviously, we can't guarantee that this would be the case for every organization, but the fundamental concepts of quality management, quality assurance, environmental management, and responsible care haven't changed that much. It's just asking you to put forth some different ideas or different information about your organization that we may not have looked at before. Our auditors are professionals. They've been in the business for quite some time, understand that a number of them have been through 2 or 3 iterations of the standards already, and understand that organizations need time to change. They need time to fully appreciate the letter of the standard as opposed to the intent. So in a nutshell, being prepared and understanding what those changes are is probably one of the biggest takeaways for us. If our clients, obviously, the better they're prepared, the smoother the transition process is. And for us, communication for all of our clients has been a key component. It is a lesson learned for us. The more we communicate in a timely manner with as much information as possible and provide you with the tools that you need to transition, so much the better. So the transition timeline requirements, 2017 was our year that we targeted. We had a large volume of transitions in 2017, but now that we're into 2018, we need to look at some key dates. March 15th, 2018, so not too far down the road from now, we will no longer be able to perform any audits after that date, and certainly we won't be able to recertify to the quote-unquote old versions of the standard. By June 15th, we were hoping to have all of the audits completed, but that's not going to be the case. We do have audits for transition for all 3 standards scheduled after that, but we want to make sure that as we talk to organizations that they try to schedule them as soon as possible so that we can get dates locked down, and certainly our best efforts to have your preferred audit or auditor or audit team available to do your transition audit. And September 14, 2018, all of our clients registered to, well, the 14,001 and certainly 9,001. We have to have that transition to the 2015 versions completed. So another polling question, have you already scheduled your transition audit, or maybe you've already completed it? Wow, that's really good. The 80-20 rule is sort of applying here, so that's great news. And for the 17.5% that are on the call, please do your best to at least lock in dates for your transition audit, whether it be for 914 or RC 14001, as soon as possible. The next question has to do with briefing your top management. With the 2008 version of 9001, and certainly with the 2004 and 2013 versions of 14001 and RC 14001 respectively, there was a need for top management to be engaged, but that comes out a lot more in the requirements of this standard, considering the things that the standards are requiring you to define. Traditionally, quality management or environmental management personnel have been the key facilitators, and that continues to be the case. However, there's a lot more top management involvement required with the new versions of the standard. Again, a very good result. That's really good news to see that top management at your organizations are engaged with the process of the transition and what it means to the organization. So the transition process, strongly encourage you to visit the NSF bookstore if you haven't already to purchase the 9001 2015 or 14,001 2015 standard. Perhaps you've already done that. Also strongly recommending not only becoming familiar with the standard itself and the maybe new terminology or newer terminology, but look at the annexes. There's a lot of helpful information based on approach, and that goes both ways for the clients, yourselves, and our audit teams going out there. What should the expectations be? Case in point would be documented information and what that needs to look like. What form can it take? The standard really opens, or the standards, pardon me, really open up the possibilities in terms of what can be considered documented information as opposed to old terminology that was documented procedures. Become informed on the requirements. We do have lots of information available for you on our update page with upgrade information, white papers, different tools. So please make use of those. For your organizations, maybe you want to do your own gap analysis or have us do a gap analysis for you to find out where the deltas are and what needs to be worked on. Deltas being the differences between old standard and new, or past or current state and what future state your system is going to look like. And then taking the time to update your documented information where it needs to. No need to throw everything out because it can form an integral part of what we considered your documented information already. Make the changes as necessary. Obviously, perform your internal audits to be able to verify your compliance to the new requirements and make adjustments where needed. Conduct a management review using the requirements in a new version of the standard. And based on the outputs of management review, putting into place any activities that need to happen, any process changes perhaps that management sees, and then have your transition audit. It's our job to go in and validate what you've already changed in your organization and validate compliance. So if you're doing an internal audit and it says we had problems in these areas but we fixed them, our audit is going to look at that and say yes or no, you meet the requirements now, and we can proceed with a recommendation to register to the new version of the standard. I mentioned the NSF-ISR webpage. The link is there for you, and certainly it'll be in the PDF version of the presentation that you get after this, so you can look up all of the different standards that are listed there. And certainly if your organization is registered to another standard as well, like the IATF 16949 or the aerospace standards, there's lots of valuable information there as well. So one of the tools that's out on the website is the Delta checklist. This is not a mandatory document, but certainly it can be a very helpful tool. The intent was for this to be a project plan. It lists out the major changes. The one here is the 9001, and in a few moments, Joy will speak to the ISO 14001 and RC 14001 Delta checklists as well. The concept is that you've got these deltas in front of you, either just citing over on the right-hand side document reference where you've made the change, or certainly you can use it as a planning tool to say, we need to make an adjustment here, who's going to be responsible for it, when is the due date for it, and is it actually completed? So with that, I'm going to let Joy take over and walk us through the EMS side of it.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you again, everybody, for taking time out of your busy day to spend time with us and learning lessons on the transition. So as Marty mentioned, and I just want to verify everybody can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So for the ISO 14001, it's set up very similarly to how the quality management Delta checklist is. And again, I just urge you, while it is a voluntary tool, it will help you, one, ensure that you have everything covered. And then when the auditor does come in, if you have it, at least a draft filled out, I think it will make your transition audit go extra smooth. So there won't be any questions as far as did you miss anything or not. So these tools can be very helpful. If you're in responsible care management, as you know, that covers both environmental, occupational health and safety, process safety, product safety, and security. So it uses the basis of the ISO 14001 Delta checklist, and then there's different tabs for the other components of it, occupational health and safety, process, and security. So this is, again, is a very helpful tool for responsible care, and it has it organized by tabs on an Excel spreadsheet by the content. Marty?
Oh, pardon me. I was muted. Okay, so what's new? For the 2015 versions, I can certainly speak to the ones that are common. The structure of the ISO standards themselves have changed to what's called the Annex SL format. And then they've added terminology that you need to become familiar with. We've had webinars and information out there in the past as far as context of the organization to be able to define or articulate what is the purpose of your business, what is it in business for, and then interested parties, be they internal and external, how do you meet what you set out as the context of the organization, and who does it affect? That being the interested parties, so your personnel and also, for example, your customers, the community at large, and many other parties that may have an interest in how your business operates. Standards also speak to leadership and commitment, again, top management, and then cascading down through the organization. I've mentioned documented information as well. That's changed in terms of the concept of what it can be, but it doesn't take away for the need to somehow document what your system is, be it an environmental management system or quality management system. They also introduced the concept of risk-based thinking. This is really not new, but it didn't really come out explicitly in previous versions or iterations of the standards, but now it's called out to say that you need to identify what risks are inherent in your system, with your products, with the processes that you use, and then how do you prioritize those and set about mitigating those risks to ensure that your business is sustainable. And organizational knowledge is also a new concept. Training is always going to be there in determining the competency of personnel, but there is now more emphasis on organizational knowledge, sometimes called tribal knowledge, or the intellectual property that your organization has. And how do you safeguard that? And how do you make sure that that organizational knowledge doesn't go walking out the door when maybe people change jobs or they win the lottery? Or as we go into maybe some attrition or through cycles of attrition where people are retiring, that maybe you lose some good organizational knowledge that really helps your organization succeed. So Joy, if you want to touch on the EMS side of it.
So the environmental management system and the responsible care management system, of course, build on what's common that Marty just discussed. But then it's sort of like shades of gray. There are some nuances. So with the context of the organization, it includes, and this, even if you are quality management, you may want to think about this as well, issues that not only how your organization could impact the environment, but also where you're located at and the environment that you're in could actually affect your organization. Example being if there's extreme weather events or earthquakes or something like that, how could that impact either you, the organization where you're at, or your supply chain? So those are some things to think about. The other thing that is unique to the environmental management system and the responsible care management system is a concept called life cycle perspectives. While that was in the older version of the standard, it's highlighted much more clearly in the new version, and it's actually defined. And I think it's important for all organizations to understand that there is a definition which is in the international standard, including raw materials, design, production, transportation, and delivery, both to and from your organization, the use, end-life treatment, and final disposal. And I have found that in some organizations, life cycle is defined a little bit differently, but you do need to use the definition that is actually in the international standard. The other thing that Marty mentioned was the risk-based thinking in the environmental management system and in ISO 14001. They talk about risks and opportunities and planning to take action. Specifically in the environmental management system in RC 14001, they talk about risks and opportunities associated with including the potential for external environmental conditions to affect your organization. So those are the kinds of things that you need to think about, and we've seen that is sometimes a gap and people forget about that piece of it. In the new environmental management system, there's a lot of emphasis in the operational control, Section 8, regarding and specifying how an organization communicates the environmental requirements for procurement, whether you're purchasing, contracting, using contractors or other specifications. How are you communicating that and how are you controlling that in your operation? So that's a new emphasis associated with that. And then while there's always been performance, the emphasis is on ongoing, continual environmental performance. And the environmental performance talks about not only what you can control, but what you can influence. And the influence could be through your contract language, through your professional organizations. There are a whole lot of different ways that you can influence it. And then it also talks about controlling and influence and considering your environmental performance from the life cycle perspective. Marty, did you want to speak to the
Sure.
what's the same?
Yeah. So things that didn't go away from the previous versions of the standard, certainly for QMS, the process approach to both operating your system and for us, the way that we would audit it, looking at a process approach, top management commitment, as I mentioned, the aspects of leadership and having management, senior management engaged so that they can provide resources where necessary to support the success of the management system, again, be it environmental or quality. Quality policies are still with us. The organization needs to be able to show that they've got a policy for environmental policy or quality policy and that the management is committed to that. Corrective actions are still with us. Preventive actions are with us as well, but they don't show up as their own section per se, but you would capture that more in the risk-based thinking, that you're looking at data, you're looking at previous issues maybe that your organization had and trying to avoid similar or recurring problems. Internal audits, the need is still there to do internal audits of your management system, as well as the management review, that sort of 40,000-foot look for senior management or top management in your organization to see what's happening with the different processes, performance to measurables, metrics, or KPIs, whichever terminology you use, and the need for documents. So documents meaning maybe an overall quality policy manual, perhaps the need for procedures or other types of documented information, and certainly in the case of QMS, shop floor or work instruction level documents.
In addition to the common issues that Marty just described above for the quality management system, environmental management system, and responsible care management systems, for those of you who are not as familiar with the environmental management system, we still have the requirement for having an environmental policy, for identifying the environmental aspects and the potential impacts and then prioritizing those. Looking at your environmental performance. The shades of gray are there's more specifics on how you do it, but that still is the same. And then again, the legal and other requirements associated with environmental management systems and the competence training and awareness specific to environmental and responsible care are a little bit are the same.
So in order to have an effective transition, we tried to illustrate this in terms of a PDCA approach. I'll pull out the old joke here that PDCA doesn't stand for please don't change anything. Rather, using the process approach and saying plan, do, check, act in terms of how are you going to transition. So we've already mentioned obtaining copies of the new standards for people especially the facilitator or the leader in your organization who's going to be responsible for the management system and its transition. Briefing your top management on the changes, training your key internal staff to the standard, whether it be the 9001-14 or RC-14, getting input from interested parties related to needs and expectations. So in this case, especially for environmental, you may need to reach out to either internal personnel or perhaps some external parties to find out what their needs and expectations are. Some of them might be very obvious, but others may not have been communicated properly in the past. And one of probably the most important one here, I guess, on the list in terms of scheduling your transition audit to occur before December 15th, 2018. To be able to lock that in, please do use the Delta checklist. Certainly, like I mentioned, it is optional. You don't need to use the whole thing, but perhaps at least being able to communicate with your auditor that, yes, we've addressed these, and here's where you can find it in our documented information. Plan any required changes and assign the responsibilities for that to happen, and have due dates for those things to occur. And then if there are additional resources needed, and maybe not just human resources, but in some cases there may be a need for computer systems or maybe additional hardware or something of that nature that's going to help you in order to update your system and help you with your success story for the transition. The due part is the implementation phase. So rolling out those changes and continuing to communicate to personnel what's changing in the system. Are there any new expectations? Are there new measures? Are there new nuances that need to be part of your system? Utilizing the input that I mentioned as far as your organizational context and the interested parties to look at your risk opportunities and plan accordingly. You would monitor the implementation through your process measures. So those would be, again, your KPIs or metrics, whatever you call them, whatever tells you whether your system or your process is actually functioning as anticipated, as needed, or to customer expectations. And integrate these into your existing system processes. The checking part would come down to, well, I suppose the monitoring of your metrics or KPIs, but also performing your internal audit. And audit your entire system. This is one of the fundamental things that needs to be done in terms of your transition going smoothly, would be to do an overall internal audit that covers every process, and that way touches all of the requirements in the new versions of the standard. If there are any gaps in your system or things that you would note as deficiencies, then raise cars as you normally would, or whatever you call the nonconformances, and get the corrective actions from the responsible parties to fix the system and certainly improve it. And then performing the management review, that 40,000-foot view of your organization and the health of the system, to make sure that you have a reasonable expectation that going into a transition audit with your NSF-ISR auditor, that you are compliant with the requirements. And finally, the ACT, looking at the outputs of the management review as required in the standards, to look at, do we need any additional changes to the system, or do we need resources to either be new resources or reassigned, redeployed in order to meet the requirements of the standard, certainly, but also to make your system work the way that you intended to. If there are any issues with goals and objectives that were set in terms of your metrics or KPIs, maybe some of the goals and objectives were unrealistic, and some of the data points to having a different set of goals and objectives that are more reasonable, more measurable, make sense to the organization, then make those adjustments. And finally, just taking action to implement any other changes for your system that are required. I mentioned earlier that there were a lot of organizations that have already gone through the transition process, be it in 2016, 17, or already early this year, with few or maybe no cars being issued by the NSF-ISR auditor. This is sort of a glimpse at what you can see with the division of the cars that have been issued. And this is by the major section as opposed to the specific clause. Certainly context of the organization is one that maybe jumps out at 14%, but the planning aspects, just being able to show how your organization plans its system to make sure that either your product realization or management of your environmental aspects is actually working. How is your system set up? Joy, did you want to touch on this a little bit further?
I was going to just say that, and just to point out that this is a snapshot in time, but also just I've looked at the snapshots in time, and remembering that transition is not as hard as you think it is. And we've really seen that if you look at 100% at any snapshot in time, we've seen about 40% of organizations go through a transition audit with no cars at all. We've seen 10% about that actually had some major cars, but about half of 50% have minor cars. And so that's why we're looking at the minor cars, because that's where most organizations are, but there's still quite a bit of organizations that have successfully completed a transition audit without any minor or major nonconformances. So congratulations. And remember, if you do get a minor or major corrective action, it's just part of continual improvement, and this is a new standard. And so you can't expect perfection the first time out. I wanted to focus on a little bit on the context of the organization, just as an example, because we have recently, if you should have received, if you're an NSF client, this is only available for NSF clients. If you go to NSF Online, there is an email, or you can just go to NSF Online, and this shows you where you go for announcements. And then there's a couple of new tools that are available. Tool 1 has a video to go along with it. Tool 2 does not, but you can use that to help you with your transition. And it's part of a toolbox. Tool number 1 talks about understanding the organization and its context. And while this specific tool example I'm showing is for ISO 14001, it is designed so that quality management systems can go in and make modifications to the questions as appropriate. We have, again, identified this as examples of on the environmental side. We look at both the context of the organization, how it might impact the environment and vice versa, and then some other contextual things that are called out in ISO 14001. But the way it's set up is that 9001 can go in and use it and actually modify the questions to meet your needs. And there's a video that explains that. Just be sure that if you go in and just change the questions, don't cut and paste the lines, because then you'll break the links. But the way it answers yes and no, and then there's a scoring to help you understand what your risks and opportunities might be for both your organization as well as your supply chain. And that can then help you identify what areas you may want to focus on. And remember, this is an optional tool. You're not required to do this. And even if you do it, it does not guarantee that you're going to make your audit go any smoother or not, but it is a tool to help people get your mind around some of these new concepts that haven't been there before. And all of the terms are pulled out of the annex, so good luck if you want to use that. The other tool, tool number 2, and both these tools have an example component of it. So there's 2 pieces of it. One is an example, so you can take a look at a fictitious organization called Orca Outdoor Pursuit. And then there's a shell, and the shell is actually what you use, and that's what you learn about in the video that explains that. Tool number 2 talks about interested parties, their needs and expectations. It's an Excel tool. On the Resource tab, there's examples of potential internal interested parties, things potentially to trigger imagination or how it may impact your organization, and then some potential external interested parties. The Interested Parties tool, again, it's a simple Excel spreadsheet. The upper one shows a shell, and again, it talks about who's the interested party, what are their interests, some contact information about it. And then part of the issue with both tool number 1 and 2, the context of the organization and the interested parties, it talks about, so is it relevant to your organization, and are you going to manage it? And if you're going to manage it, how? And then that would then feed into some of your risks and opportunities in Clause 6 and planning action. So the upper one in green is just the shell. The lower one that's in the brownish tones, that is the example of for the fictitious organization as far as what the needs and expectations were for this particular fictitious organization called Orca Outdoor Pursuits. And then there's a summary tab where you really just pull out for both internal and external parties what their relevant interests are, their relevant needs, and expectations, and if there's any risks or opportunities associated with it. And so these risks and opportunities can help inform you and your organization as far as what you may want to put in place to either manage those risks or take advantage of the opportunities. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is that for the organizations that might have minor or major corrective actions, we are not able to complete your certification process and issue your certificate until you have appropriately taken action for your minor or major nonconformances. The process hasn't changed. Minor nonconformances, you need to do a root cause analysis and submit your corrective action plan. It needs to be accepted, and then you're good to go. The requirement is to preferably have that completed within 30 days of your closing meeting. Now, just remember, you cannot have your certificate for the new standard, even if it's pending minor nonconformances, until those are closed out or approved. On the major nonconformances, generally that would require an on-site review, and hopefully none of you will be in that position because you'll be well planned, but this outlines what that is, and so you'll have this information. The other area I wanted to focus in on is this whole issue of the life cycle perspective. Again, we talked about what the definition in ISO 14001 talks about. This might be something you may want to think about from the quality management as well. Again, it talks about acquisition of raw materials, the design, production, transportation, delivery, use, end of life, and final disposal. And I think it fits in nicely. If those of you who are familiar with QMS 9001, it talks about the sources, the inputs, the activities, outputs, and receivers. And so whether it's your energy, whether it's the raw materials coming in, it all kind of fits in there together. This has been an area that people have struggled with in ISO 14001 and RCMS to some extent, but I've also seen some organizations have some really cool ways of doing it. And even if you're not environmental management, you might want to think about it for quality management, because generally on environmental management, if you put these things in place, you'll save money as well. So for example, on the life cycle perspective, what could an organization do to control or influence? Some of it can be your contract requirements or your specifications for design or for procuring materials. Coming up with a boilerplate so that you always are clearly communicating that to your contractors, to your purchasing. Do you have your purchasing folks involved in it? Do we have it? And do you have something in place? And we've seen some really good organizations that have taken a role in this, and I'm actually going to have a webinar specifically on this, and we'll let you know about that. Safer choice is something that actually allows you to consider if you're purchasing chemicals. There are oftentimes chemicals that are safer for your employees as well as for the environment. And so you may want to think about what options you might have there. So that's also another tool we've seen being implemented in the field that people find quite helpful and can save them money, whether if it's not in the purchasing end, which it may be, but clearly on the other ends of managing hazardous waste or disposing of it, or occupational exposure and time off for illness or injury exposure. The other thing we've seen a lot of is reuse and recycling at the actual manufacturing site. So many of you may be doing it in quality management. You may not want it. And what we've seen is people do it, but they aren't actually taking credit for it on their performance approach and performance evaluation. So there's lots of opportunities there. On the transportation, we've seen folks actually specify or give preference in their selection for logistics for both delivery as well as distribution of their products using the SMART way. This is an EPA program where organizations are certified for either engine efficiency, using cleaner fuels, et cetera. So it's kind of exciting to see what people are using in the field. There's all kinds of innovations. These are just some examples. And again, I will be having a future webinar focusing on this and bringing in some examples of what's worked well on the field. So in summary, in this session, we've talked about the types of services that NSF covers overall, NSF International. We've talked about the transition process, what's new, what's the same, and some effective and what needs to be done for an effective transition, and some optional tools that are available to NSF customers, but also some tools that are available to anybody online. So I guess we're at the point for question and answers, and I'm going to turn it over to Katie at this point.
Well, before we do that, if I could, I just want to maybe touch on a couple of items that may not have come out as clearly or weren't written in there, but the overall message and what we've learned with doing the transition audits, and certainly speaking with auditors and clients alike for the transitions, is number one, try not to overthink what the changes are. A lot of the concepts in here, while they're new for the standard itself, in order to run an effective and sustainable business, they were always part of your organization. It's just now that you need to articulate them as part of what we do during an audit. Case in point would be engaging top management early in the process of transitioning to the standard, to maybe the facilitator or quality manager or environmental manager would take a stab at putting together what they believe the context of the organization is, but then vet that through top management of the organization and get their buy-in or get them to help craft that message to what it's going to be and incorporate that into your documented information. Also, the same would be, sitting down and putting together a list of interested parties, the internal ones, the external ones, and certainly use the tool for that. And again, run that by top management, because maybe there's some that are not being looked at. Maybe, I don't know, the bank or some finance organization is an interested party in how your organization is doing. That wouldn't maybe be readily, that information may not be readily available to everyone in the organization who's working on putting the management system together, but certainly they may be an interested party. Once you've determined maybe what the risks are for the organization, go by top management again, and maybe there's more risks that weren't thought of initially, and certainly with prioritizing those risks and the mitigation that needs to go along with it. Maybe there's capital expenditures that are necessary to mitigate certain risks that top management needs to be involved in, and maybe they get backburnered a little bit in order to work on things that are maybe easier or quicker fixes in the short term, and certainly the provision of resources to help with that. So maybe a few editorial comments of things to think of. And also when it comes to the transition audit, if you've prepared and looked at your Delta checklist and got that completed, when you think about what the auditor is going to ask you to demonstrate that you've incorporated these into your management system, give examples, have examples ready to go to be able to articulate that and present it to the auditor so that they can write down positive compliance notes. So be proactive with the audit approach, because as an auditor myself, it's much easier to have the organization giving you a presentation about how they meet the requirements of the standard, as opposed to trying to drag that information out of you and then looking at a bunch of different documents in order to get to the same point that you could have presented very quickly and easily.
Okay, I can get started with the questions and answers. Joy and Marty, if you guys are ready for a couple of those. The first one that came in is, what new items need to be added to management review meeting?
The actual list of the requirements are listed in the international standard under Section 9 and 10, and so I would just recommend that you would go through and be sure that you have everything on those checklists that is identified, not a checklist, but in the standard as far as what specifically is there. A lot of the stuff, I'd say probably 80% is the same. You do need to be sure that you have external and internal issues identified, and the needs and expectations of your interested parties is part of it. And again, this is risks and opportunities for the environmental management. This is Joy, so I'm speaking from the environmental management side. But it's at 9.3. Just go through that management review and be sure you have all of that information. And the focus, again, is also continues on the continual improvement. They do emphasize in the environmental management system as far as what opportunities you've taken to improve the integration of your management system into your overall business practices and processes. Marty, did you want to add anything from the 14,001 side? And excuse me, 9,001 side?
No, what you said is correct. It's pretty much the same, but do bear in mind that you're looking at risks and opportunities as well from Section 6.1 of the standard, and making sure that that's woven into the management review conversation, especially the effectiveness of actions that you've already taken. And that needs to be considered as well when you get to the outputs of management review, and making sure that perhaps the management review outputs also include actions for risk mitigation or assignment of resources for risk mitigation.
So Joy, there's a couple questions on here about where people can find the tool. Do you want to talk through that a little bit?
I was on mute. Sure. So again, the tools are optional, and it's available to our NSF customers. And so you go to NSF On Line. Here, if you can see on this, can you see the screen here? Under announcements, it has announcements, and then it has like the announcement about tool number 1. If you just click on that, and then that will take you to where it's at. And it's actually under a new portion of NSF Online that you probably haven't been to, and it's called like Standards. I don't have an actual print copy of that here, but you go to that, and then you can either click on the link to the video, or you can click on, there's 2 links to either the shell document, which is the document for the tool that you would fill out, or the sample. And I would recommend that you actually do take a look at the video, in particular for tool number 1. I would recommend you do take a quick look at the example or sample tool, because that shows how it was filled out, and how, as you fill it out, depending on your answers yes or no, it rolls up into whether it's a risk or opportunity. And it's divided by whether it's, the questions are divided by your organization or interested parties. But it is for NSF Online. If you have troubles finding it, you can contact your account manager, and they can help walk you through getting there, or give me a call.
Okay. Thank you, Joy, for that. We have a question that says, will we have to submit 5 whys, I believe is the question, with each nonconformance?
It's not mandatory. What is mandatory is that you do have a root cause analysis in some way, shape, or form. And we always recommend the 5 why approach because it will drive you to the root cause. So is it mandatory? No, but you need to be able to demonstrate in your responses that you actually somehow analyzed the root cause and gotten to it.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. I have a question here. It says, when it comes to ISO 9001 and thinking about risks, is it looking at risk from the whole business, just from the quality side?
Yeah, the standard has really opened itself up in that way because, I mean, just had another meeting this morning where it was mentioned by somebody that maybe it's a mistake to keep considering this a quality management system because it is a business management system. So there are things that you need to consider from an entire business perspective. Obviously for quality, things that will have an impact on the quality of your product and what your customers' needs and expectations are. But a very simple example may be risks to your organization that exist if, let's say, you lose your internet service provider or you don't have internet for a certain period of time. What will you do to mitigate that? Because maybe your customers have online systems or you need to use internet to be able to create shipping documents or communicate effectively with your customer. So all of those things are somehow going to have an impact on the customer or other interested parties. You should look at those. At the outset, I would say keep it simple and focus on what's necessary for the quality management system or environmental management system. And then over time, you become more adept at identifying what those risks are and taking credit for things that you have already considered as risks and taken action to mitigate them.
Thank you, Marty. So a couple more questions, one of them being samples of documents / forms to meet risk and opportunities requirement. What would be some samples of documents and forms to meet risk and opportunity requirement?
Well, from the QMS side, I mean, if you consider things like automotive or aerospace standards, they use the PFMEA, Process Failure Modes Effects Analysis. Document is a tool, but it doesn't need to be so in-depth, I would say. And we can't be prescriptive. So even some sort of document or some way of showing that here's a list of risks that we looked at. Maybe you've ranked them as high, medium, low risk, and then some information that links to that to show what actions are planned or what actions have been taken and how effective those have been. Because remember, that's part of management review is the effectiveness of risks and opportunities or the actions taken to mitigate risks. So linking those all together, it can be any format, just as long as your internal auditors can understand it, and certainly later our auditors can understand it and give you credit for complying with the requirements.
And this is Joy, and I know the question was specifically for 9001, but for the 14001, generally if you take a look at your environmental aspects list and the criteria, risks, whether it's the interested parties, whether it's regulatory or compliance, or other criteria that your organization uses, that's a really good place for you to be able then to identify risks and opportunities. And if you have an integrated system, QMS should probably take a look at that, what environmental is looking at, because it could inform your risks and opportunities as well. And it's a good place to document it.
Okay. When identifying interested parties, do you need to identify each person by name or just in general? For example, competitors or neighbors?
That's really up to the organization itself. And I mean, you can go to any level of granularity that you need to in order to assess who the interested parties are. There may be specific individuals, or it may be as simple as just saying, let's say, internal interested party being your workforce, or by subcategory of your personnel. Maybe welders have different needs than painters or machine operators. It's up to the organization.
And I would say the same for responsible care management and environmental management system too. Here's, the examples talk about, at least the organization and if there is a point of contact as far as how you obtain the information, but you can obtain it through a variety of methods, whether it's in person, whether it's an email, whether it's a complaint, whether it's a meeting, there's a wide variety. Get credit for what you're doing.
So I have one more question here. Would it be safe to state that risk-based thinking, risk management, product safety, counterfeit detection, and transfer of work to an external provider are the major changes between the ISO 9001-2008 and the 2015 standards?
Yeah, I believe that would be a safe assessment. But when you look at those, there's always been an element of those things included in previous iterations of the standard, but you do need to look at where the
Marty might have got cut off.
Yeah.
Joy, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm good. It was a 9001 question, so.
We may have lost Marty for a second in his audio, but that was actually the last question that came in for today, and we are only 2 minutes over, which was really great. I wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar today and your time and taking your time and sitting through this session with us. I will mention again that there will be a follow-up email where you receive a link to the complete webinar recording as well as a PDF of just the slides. So you can expect that within the week to come into your inbox. We will follow up with some questions that were more specific with those people directly. So thank you so much for the really great Q&A and for sitting in on this session the whole time. There will be more webinars to come for both 9001 as well as 14,001 in RC and RCMS. So please keep an eye on your email boxes for those. And thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.